Yes, gentleman there.
So can I just start by saying it's actually quite encouraging to have the First Minister here as a young professional who's gay and found it quite difficult in the workplace sometimes to be myself. I think it's quite encouraging to have the government behind you. But part of the role that I do is kind of challenge the Scottish insurance industry on equality and diversity as a whole. As you said, you can't have a diverse board if you don't have the talent pool. So I suppose I'm kind of looking for a bit of advice how I challenge an industry to try and change and open up and be more diverse, because as you say, the old boys club, it's true within the insurance industry. So I'm kind of looking for a bit of advice on how I would challenge that.
Well, who would like to start?
I think one of these leaders.
I think it's what you were saying, Jane.
I think this is your turn.
Earlier.
Thank you. It's really interesting. When we did the Women in Finance Charter, the insurance companies were the hardest to get to sign up, but they have. And I think that that's really encouraging, because as I'm starting to get a little bit more sort of cross about the people that don't, the really interesting thing for me on the Women in Finance Charter, I accept it's not quite the full diversity issues that you're talking about, is that I'm starting to say now, look, everybody knows about this charter. The companies that haven't signed up, a lot have actively chosen not to. Why would you work for them? I think we absolutely need to start to take a stand and not just say, oh, you know, have my company started up or not, that's interesting. But if you haven't, I think we should be challenging the boards, we should be challenging the CEOs and the leaders and really making it not acceptable for organisations not to commit to doing the right thing, both because, as the First Minister said too, it's the right thing to do, but it's the economically sensible thing to do. And I think you have to be brave to do it. And I think your point that the government's behind you, and I think everybody in this room is behind you, and that we should, you know, whoever the gentleman was earlier that said perhaps we should unite in force in order to make that point clear. I think we should be saying these are organisations that are not embracing the agenda, and we should make sure that they do, or we shouldn't work there.
I think that's, I mean, my view is it's better to try and encourage a voluntary approach as far as we can. And yeah, I'm a great believer in the carrot being often more powerful than the stick. But you know, you get to a point where, and we're not far away from this, the companies that aren't signing up, as Jane Ann says, are the ones that just are deciding not to do it. And that starts to, even without a government naming and shaming, that's going to become increasingly obvious. And it is going to start, I think, creating the conditions where people can make decisions, not just about what companies they work for, but what companies they choose to buy from and take their custom to. And so, you know, I think people working within companies just now should feel quite empowered about this. There's plenty of government initiatives that you can challenge your employers with. Why are you not doing this? Why are you not doing that? And over time, and not too much time, it's going to become, I think, much more difficult for companies to justify why they're not doing the right thing.
Is naming and shaming something you consider as a government?
I would never want to name and shame anybody.
I think it was mentioned,
I do think,
talked about at Westminster,
yeah,
wasn't it?
I'm not, I think the whole naming and shaming thing is a kind of unfortunate sort of terminology, because it doesn't, I think, create the right environment. But do you get to a point where, you know, if a company, for example, is not signing up to the business pledge because they're saying they do not want to commit to gender equality at some point in the future, then, you know, would I, as First Minister, have too much compunction about saying that if I'm challenged about why a particular company is? No, I wouldn't, because I think it is important that we are prepared to reward the good, but also start to take away the hiding places from the bad. So if you're asking me, do I think we should, you know, get into a situation where we're publishing every quarter, you know, shame lists of companies? No, but equally, as First Minister, if there's a company clearly not using these kind of progressive practices, equally, I don't think we should be shy at saying that.
And I think as well that you don't have to shame the ones that haven't signed if you're publishing and celebrating the ones that have. In my experience, the thing that's quite helpful at the moment is that, and I don't always think the press is helpful, but actually there's quite a lot of interest in the press on this Women's Charter. You know, tell us who's signed up. And it's the press that are saying, well, why haven't you signed up to the ones that haven't? And I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. There's a few hands. You've been waiting for a while, so I'll get to you first.
Hi. I wondered if you could comment on how we can go forward in diversity and inclusion in a political situation that in the last year, and Jane Ann, you started talking about this a little bit, or touched on it slightly, but in a world where, you know, Trump is now espousing very anti-immigration, anti-women views, and we've got Brexit around the corner, realizing that both of those were voted in. You know, those were voted in by popular. So I work in D&I, and I'm finding now a real shock to the system. And I'm just wondering, I'm just asking for your comment on this, because at times I think there's never been a more important time for D&I, but I also didn't expect the kind of aftershocks that the last year has created about what the popular vote feels potentially about these issues.
Well, I take a fairly simple view of this. I think when you have a situation where you've got sort of currents coming in the wrong direction, and you feel as if you're against a tide, that's not the time to shrink back from these arguments. And you know, there's a whole range of different arguments that would fall into this category just now, and a whole load of different values. It's time to step up and actually take a stand and to, you know, be counted on these things. So, you know, I would say everything we're talking about today, given some of the political developments you talk about, makes it all the more important that we are really firm in what it is we're trying to achieve. But we also need to celebrate what's good. I mean, I'm, you know, as depressed about Brexit as I think you sounded as if you were, and well, I won't go on I won't say too much about President Trump. But, you know, we can get depressed about that, or we can remind ourselves of the fact we live in a country where we have a woman as Prime Minister, a woman as First Minister, a woman in Scotland, a woman as leader of the main opposition, a woman of the third biggest opposition party, a gender balanced cabinet, and we can say, well, actually, we're going to take these things and work really hard to counter what's coming in the opposite direction. I'm not saying it's easy, and trust me, I have got some profound concerns about some of the political developments of late and what they might lead to in terms of, and what we're already seeing in some respects, in terms of rolling back some of the equality gains of the last few years. So I'm not being naive or closing my eyes to some of the reality of that, but it makes it more important that those of us who think that the direction of travel we've been on is the right one actually get our shoulders even more firmly to the wheel.
And can I just add to that then, which I completely endorse, and I think the role of business is to speak up too. And you know, often I just think, you know, who cares what I think really, but if we don't say what we think, then we're going to get what we don't want, maybe, or what some of us don't want. And I do feel myself there's a bit of an imperative now for us to make sure that everybody's voices are heard, not just the loudest voices that have won the populist vote, maybe.
There's a couple more questions. I know we're running out of time. We've heard from you before. If you don't mind, if we've got time, I'll come back to you. There's somebody over there. Yes.
Sorry, I also have asked a question before.
Sorry, I just realised that.
With regard to a lot of what I said, and I was delighted to hear the First Minister mention it, is there not something we can do with regards to really putting forward a lot of the statistics that prove that more women on boards is actually more economic for businesses, with regards to the work that LSE has done, McKinsey and Co. There are stats out there, and I don't think we keep going on about kind of the social aspect of it, but there's an economic benefit as well, and I don't think that's been pushed further or far enough. Do any of you have any comment on that? Or
I agree with you. I make a point, every conversation I have about these issues, I talk as much about the practical economic benefits as I do about the social principled arguments, because I think for most people, maybe not for absolutely everybody, but for most people the kind of principal argument is accepted and won. I think it's much more important now to focus on the hard-headed, almost self-interested arguments. Through the business pledge and the 50-50 by 2020 campaign, as government, we try to get as much of that information out there as possible, but I think that's still, you know, very much work in progress, and it's one of the things I would say to everybody in the room is we've all got an obligation to do that, to get that, you know, really hard evidence across to decision makers in whatever organisation to get them educated that this really is something that is in their own interests as well as the right thing to do.
And it's not just the decision makers, although they're important. I had dinner 10 days ago with one of the CEOs of one of the big banks who signed up to all of this, and he said, Jane Ann, you've got a big problem because I'm finding my HR team are pushing back on me And sometimes we blame the CEOs and don't think about that happening. And I think, you know, we all need to address that as well, because just because it's hard doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be doing it.
Right.
I was just going to
Yes,
add, I mean, I do
sure.
think that as well as the kind of empirical evidence, there's just an enormous culture change that has to take place, and I just think we should be cognizant of that. And just going back to the earlier point about Brexit and the various forces at play, I think there's an enormous cultural shift, not just within business, not just within political leaders and all the rest of it, but actually going right through to education and changing the kind of tectonic plates about that and how we approach education, how we approach female education in particular. You know, for example, on the vocational side of things, if girls are being encouraged to do particular courses, can we also ensure that they are vocational courses with finance and accounting and everything tacked on, so that they're being equipped not just to, for example, be cosmetologists or whatever you want to call it, but to set up their own business, because ultimately that's the most empowering thing. So I think there's a massive cultural shift that takes nudges all along the way.
So we did, just as an aside on that, we did, so Mark, I'm not going to remember all the exact figures off the top of my head, but the impact on the Scottish economy, on our GDP, if we had a situation where women were starting businesses at the same rate as men, and the figures are quite startling. So there is just another bit of it, and as you say, that's the most empowering kind of thing we can talk about. So this evidence here, it's there, we just need to get it disseminated and out there.
7.6 billion.
Thank you.
How much was that?
7.6 billion.
7.6 billion, wow. Okay, we've got time for one last question. Someone had their hand up and they're taking it down.
I am a big fan of quotas, and I would like to hear some views about quotas. Also, to pick up on the gentleman's point about social diversity, I think that's really important as well. As well as issue of quotas, I'd be interested in what the panel think about almost like apprentice boards.
First of all, the quotas. I mean, you've said that you prefer the carrot to the stick approach, but
I have no issue with quotas, and you know, not all women agree with us. I've been a long believer that if quotas are what is necessary to do this, then we shouldn't shy away from that. And it goes back to my argument about merit. You know, the argument that's used against quotas is, well, appointments should be on merit. Well, appointments are not on merit just now, because if they were, we wouldn't have this issue we're talking about. So the reason that the 50-50 by 2020 campaign is voluntary is a very practical one. In Scotland, we've got the power to legislate with public boards, which we are doing in terms of quotas. We don't have that power for private boards, so we've kind of got no alternative but to do it by voluntary mechanisms. But you know, in the political sphere in my own party, I've often, or on occasion, not so much recently, but years ago, been on the wrong side of this argument. I've been a believer in the benefits of positive action, whether that's quotas or other forms of positive action. Briefly on the other points, mentoring, I think the whole idea of mentoring in terms of boards is a really important one. And lastly, your point about social diversity. We're talking about gender today, and you know, that's appropriate that we do that, but diversity is a bit more than gender. It's about race, it's about disability, it's about social issues. So I think we've got to see diversity in its broader sense.
Rachel, get your views on quotas and also the notion of apprentice boards, mentoring, because I think you do a lot of that in your company.
Absolutely. From a Mighty's perspective, we don't sign up to quotas. We have until recently had both our female senior leaders within the company, but we do have lots of senior executives that are female within Mighty as well. We have key account management programs and other initiatives where there's the support there for female leaders to work up through the ranks within the company as well. Absolutely.
Do you think quotas would be a good thing?
No, it's not anything Mighty's ever signed up to.
Right. And what about the idea of, sorry, were you going to?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's just to ensure we've got the right people for doing the job.
And what about the idea of apprentice boards, mentoring? Is that something that you do?
Mentoring we actually do, and there's something new that we're looking at now and implementing, which is job swaps. and secondments as well. So there's other opportunities for people within Mighty to look at other areas of the business and actually step up and be seconded into a role for a certain period of time.
Is that female to female? Because Nicola, I think you were talking about female role models, mentoring, but it doesn't have to be female to female. Like
And
male
sometimes
to
it
female.
might be better if it's not.
Exactly.
You know,
yes.
and nor, I mean, I remember having this, I think you were at this discussion some time ago about, you know, not, some of the best mentoring doesn't need to be people in the same kind of walk of life. It's often about, you know, broader things and just sector-specific skills. So it definitely doesn't have to be female to female. The whole point is about trying to give the best advice and the best experiences.
Sure. Isabel, on the quotas and...
Apprentice boards, definitely. I think that's a fantastic idea. On quotas, I think where public boards, absolutely. I think it makes sense. In, if you like, established, highly regulated industries, I think it's easier to have a little bit of leverage there. Where I'm less comfortable is if you look at the rump of, you know, the 99% of private enterprises in Scotland that are SMEs, you know, 82% of which are micro businesses. How do you start intervening in their kind of day-to-day business? I struggle with that a wee bit. If they're growth companies and if the development agencies are interacting with them and they're on a trajectory, I think then you can start sort of intervening a little bit more. But with quota, the hard quota per se, I'm probably less comfortable with, particularly in relation to SMEs.
And finally, Gina.
I hate the thought of quotas because I think society ought to be in a place where we don't need them, but it isn't, and therefore I'm absolutely certain we have to have them, unfortunately.
I think we're going to have to draw the questions to a close, but thanks to the First Minister and for letting us take a bit longer of your time to take those questions. Nicola Sturgeon, thank you very much. And thank you to Isabel McTaggart, Rachel Clark and Jane Ann Gadia.